I knew something was wrong the second I smelled the paint before I even opened my garage door. Not fresh wax, not engine oil. Cheap, chemical, HOA-grade paint. The kind that clings to the back of your throat and doesn't belong anywhere near a $150,000 machine. I hit the remote, and the door groaned open like it didn't want me to see what was inside. Then I saw it. My Mustang. Custom midnight blue, hand-polished, every curve reflecting months of work, buried under a flat, lifeless coat of dull gray. HOA-approved gray. My fingers hovered over the hood before I touched it. Still tacky. Still warm. Whoever did this hadn't even waited for it to dry. The texture dragged against my skin like sandpaper, and for a second, everything went quiet. No birds. No distant traffic. Just the faint hum of the neighborhood sprinklers, and that smell, sharp, invasive, wrong. I stepped back slowly, scanning the driveway, the street, the perfectly trimmed lawns lined up like soldiers under Brenda Whitmore's rule. Willowbrook Estates, where mailboxes had approved fonts and grass couldn't grow past 2.5 inches without a warning notice taped to your door. I moved here 3 weeks ago, kept to myself, worked out of my garage, kept my tools clean, my routine tighter than most people's morning coffee schedule. The Mustang wasn't just a car. It was precision, discipline. Every bolt torqued to spec, every panel aligned by hand. You don't just fix something like that overnight. You earn it. And someone had just decided it didn't fit their version of perfect. My jaw tightened as I crouched near the front bumper. There it was, a faint overspray line bleeding onto the concrete. Sloppy, rushed. Not a professional job, just confident enough to think they wouldn't get caught. That's when I heard heels on pavement. Sharp, deliberate. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Oh dear, Brenda's voice floated over my shoulder, sweet enough to rot teeth. I was hoping you'd see the improvement in better lighting. I straightened up slowly, wiping my fingers on a rag, the gray streak smearing like evidence that didn't need explaining. She stood there in her pressed white outfit, clipboard, tucked under her arm like a badge she hadn't earned. Perfect smile, perfect posture, like she was posing for a brochure about control. Your vehicle was becoming a concern, she continued, gesturing lightly toward the Mustang like it was a misplaced decoration. This community has standards, Mr. Walker. We took the liberty of bringing it into compliance. Took the liberty. I let the words sit in the air between us. Let her believe she was in control of this moment. The sprinklers clicked off somewhere down the street, and for a second, the silence pressed in heavier than before. I glanced past her, subtle, quick, at the corner of my roofline. Small black dome. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Then the one above the garage. Then the one by the driveway post. Every angle covered. Every second recorded. My pulse stayed steady. No anger. No raised voice. Just calculation. Brenda tilted her head slightly, mistaking my silence for submission. They always do. You're welcome, she added, that smile tightening just enough to show she meant the opposite. I looked back at the Mustang, at the ruined paint job, at the reflection that wasn't mine anymore. Then I looked at her. Calm. Measured. Patient. Because what Brenda Whitmore didn't know wasn't just that she'd crossed a line. It was that she'd just handed me everything I needed. I did not respond to Brenda right away because silence has a way of making people reveal more than words ever could, and she filled that silence exactly the way I expected, shifting her weight slightly, adjusting that clipboard under her arm like it gave her authority, like it made what she had done legal instead of just convenient. And I could hear the faint scratch of her pen as she made a note, probably logging my reaction as non-compliant or resistant or whatever label made her feel. Justified, and I finally nodded once, slow and controlled, like I was accepting the situation, like I was another homeowner who would fall in line, and that was all she needed because her smile relaxed, just a fraction, the kind of micro-expression you only notice if you are trained to look for it. And I have spent years reading people who thought they were in control when they were not. We will send you the invoice for the repaint, she said, already turning away like the conversation was over, like this was just another box checked in her system, and her heels clicked against the driveway as she walked off, each step confident, certain, untouchable, and I watched her go until she reached the sidewalk, until she disappeared behind the trimmed hedges that all looked exactly the same. Uniform, controlled, approved. Then I turned back to the Mustang and let the quiet settle again, heavier this time, more focused, because now this was not about the car anymore. It was about pattern, about intent, about a group of people who believed they could act without consequence. And that is when I moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just precise, pulling my phone from my pocket and opening the camera feed, scrubbing back through the night footage with my thumb. The timeline sliding smoothly until the darkness of early morning came into view. 2:17 a.m., 3 figures entering the frame, reflective vests, masks pulled up, but not enough to hide posture, not enough to hide movement. And there she was, standing just outside the edge of the camera, directing, not doing the work herself, but orchestrating it, pointing, supervising, making sure it happened exactly the way she wanted. And I paused the frame, zoomed in, captured stills, each one clearer than the last. License plate from the contractor van, timestamp overlay, sequence of events. Everything clean, everything documented, the kind of evidence that does not argue. It just exists, and I saved each file methodically, backing them up to a secure folder, labeling them by time and angle, because details matter, small details build cases, and cases build outcomes. And as I worked, I could still smell the paint, still feel the tackiness on my fingertips, but it no longer bothered me the same way. It had shifted from anger to something colder, something more useful, because they thought this was correction, they thought this was enforcement, but what they actually did was step into a space they did not understand, and I walked to the side wall of the garage, opened the metal cabinet, and pulled out a clean cloth, wiping my hands slowly, watching the gray smear fade into the fabric. And I thought about the last time I saw a situation escalate like this, how it always started small, a boundary crossed, then another, until someone assumed there were no boundaries at all. And that is when it breaks, not loudly, not all at once, but precisely, exactly where it needs to. And I closed the cabinet, set the cloth down, and looked at the Mustang one more time, at the damage, at the evidence sitting right in front of me. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they were not done yet, and that was exactly what I needed. I left the garage door open on purpose because people like Brenda do not stop after one win. They escalate, they test limits, and they watch for weakness the same way predators watch for hesitation. So I gave her exactly what she expected to see: a quiet homeowner with a damaged car and no immediate response. And by late afternoon, the neighborhood started to shift around that narrative. Curtains moving just enough to reveal silhouettes, slow drives past my house, the low hum of engines rolling over clean pavement, curiosity wrapped in caution, because in places like this nothing happens without everyone knowing. And I stepped out into the driveway with a bucket of water and a cloth, not to clean the car, but to play the part, dragging the cloth lightly across the hood, letting the gray smear and dull the surface even more, letting anyone watching believe I was trying to fix something that could not be fixed that way. And the sun hit the paint at an angle that made every flaw stand out, every uneven stroke, every rushed edge, and I could almost hear the quiet satisfaction traveling through the neighborhood. The unspoken message that compliance had been enforced, that the system worked, that Brenda's authority held, and right on schedule, at exactly 4:12 p.m., the white SUV rolled up, smooth and controlled, stopping just short of my driveway like it was a checkpoint, and Brenda stepped out again, same posture, same clipboard, but this time she was not alone. 2 other board members followed, both dressed like they were attending a meeting instead of standing in someone's driveway. And I could smell her perfume before she even spoke, something expensive layered over something sharp. "We wanted to ensure the corrective action met expectations," she said, her tone measured, professional, like this was a routine inspection, like my car was just another item on her list. And I nodded again, slow, neutral, letting my eyes move from her to the others, memorizing faces, posture, the way one of them avoided looking directly at the car, the way the other kept glancing at Brenda before speaking. "It looks compliant now," one of them added, voice uncertain, and Brenda marked something on her clipboard with a small, satisfied motion. "You will receive the final documentation and associated fees by mail," she continued, already framing this as closed, already writing the ending in her favor. And I set the cloth down on the edge of the bucket, water dripping onto the concrete in steady, controlled drops, and, for the first time I spoke, calm, even, measured. "What time did your contractor finish the work last night?" I asked, not accusing, not emotional, just a question placed carefully. And for a fraction of a second, her pen stopped moving. just long enough to register that something had shifted, but she recovered quickly, smile returning. All work was completed in accordance with community guidelines, she said, deflecting, not answering. And that told me everything I needed to know, not just about her, but about the structure behind her. Because people who operate within the law answer direct questions, people who operate around it redirect. And I picked up my phone, not raising it, just holding it loosely in my hand, letting the screen catch a reflection of the three of them standing there, framed perfectly by the open garage, the cameras above capturing everything again from multiple angles. And I could see it now, the pattern forming, the repetition of behavior, the confidence, built on assumption. And I stepped slightly to the side, giving them a clear view into the garage, into the clean lines, the organized tools, the order that never left my space. And I watched Brenda's eyes flicker just once, taking it in, processing something she had not expected, something she could not quite place. And that was the moment I knew she was not as certain as she wanted to appear, not completely, not anymore. And as they turned to leave, as the sound of their steps faded back toward the street, I glanced up at the camera again, at the silent witness that had seen everything from the beginning. And I let the corner of my mouth tighten just slightly, because they thought this was the end of it. They thought the correction was complete, but what they had actually done was create a record, a perfect, uninterrupted record, and they were about to add a lot more to it. I did not touch the car again that evening because damage like that is not something you rush to fix. It is something you document, preserve, and understand. And as the sun dropped behind the identical rooftops of Willowbrook Estates, the gray paint took on a dull metallic sheen under the fading light, like a mask that did not belong. And I stood there for a few minutes longer than necessary, letting the neighborhood settle into its routine, sprinklers clicking on in sequence, porch lights flickering to life one by one, the distant hum of a lawn mower winding down, all of it calm on the surface, controlled, predictable, exactly the way Brenda liked it. And then I stepped back inside and closed the garage door halfway, not all the way, just enough to signal I was done for the day, just enough to keep the line of sight partially open, because people who think they have authority always check twice. They look for confirmation that their decision stuck, and sure enough, around 8:37 p.m., headlights slowed in front of my house, engine idling low, a shadow passing across the narrow gap of the door, and I watched it all from the reflection in the polished chrome tools hanging on the wall, not turning, not reacting, just observing, because observation is where control begins. And once the street went quiet again, I got to work, not with the car, but with everything around it, pulling up the footage from the past 48 hours, mapping out movement patterns, identifying not just who came onto my property, but how often they passed by, how long they lingered, which vehicles belonged to which houses, building a timeline that extended beyond the act itself, because one incident can be dismissed, but a pattern cannot. And by midnight, I had a clean sequence laid out, multiple entries, repeated surveillance, coordinated behavior. And that is when I opened a new file, labeling it simply Incident Report Draft, not because I needed to file it yet, but because I knew exactly where this was going. And structure matters, language matters. The difference between a complaint and a case is precision. And I do not deal in complaints, I deal in outcomes. And as I typed, I could hear faint laughter drifting from somewhere down the street, a small gathering, glasses clinking, voices relaxed, the kind of casual celebration that comes after someone believes they have solved a problem. And I paused for a moment, listening, letting that sound settle into memory, because it would matter later. Every detail always does. Then I stood up, walked back to the garage door, and lifted it just enough to step outside. The night air cooler now, carrying a faint trace of that same chemical paint smell mixed with fresh-cut grass. And I looked down the street, calm, steady, measuring distance, visibility, angles. And then I turned back, reached up, and adjusted one of the cameras slightly, just a few degrees, refining the frame to capture the edge of the sidewalk where Brenda's SUV had stopped earlier, tightening the shot, eliminating blind spots. Because if they were going to keep checking, if they were going to keep circling, I wanted every second of it, clean and undeniable. And as I locked the garage for the night, the quiet returned again, heavier this time, not uncertain, not reactive, but controlled, because the moment had shifted. They thought they had enforced a rule, but what they had actually done was initiate a process, And processes like this do not rely on emotion. They rely on timing, on patience, on letting people continue exactly as they are until the record speaks for itself. And inside, on the screen, the footage kept running, capturing everything they thought no one was paying attention to, and I let it run. The certified letter arrived at 9:12 a.m., slid halfway under my front door like it had somewhere more important to be. Thick paper, embossed seal, the kind of envelope that tries to look official enough to intimidate before it is even opened. And I let it sit there for a full minute before picking it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. The faint smell of fresh ink still clinging to the paper, rushed printing. Recent decision, not something planned long in advance. And when I unfolded it, the language was exactly what I expected. Formal tone layered over weak authority. Notice of noncompliance, unauthorized vehicle modification, community restoration fee. Each phrase carefully chosen to sound legitimate without actually being backed by anything enforceable. And at the bottom, Brenda's signature, sharp, confident, practiced, like she had signed dozens of these without ever being challenged. And I read it once, then again slower, not for the message, but for the structure. The clauses, the assumptions baked into every line. Because documents like this are not just communication, they are evidence of intent. And intent matters, especially when it is repeated, especially when it is organized. And I set the paper down on the kitchen counter, flattening it carefully, aligning the edges with the surface like it was part of a file that had already started building itself. And through the window, I could see the street moving again, morning routines, neighbors walking, dogs, cars backing out of driveways, everything normal on the outside. But the pattern underneath was still there, still active, and right on schedule. The same white SUV rolled past again, slower this time, not stopping, just observing, confirming, and I did not move, did not react, just watched the reflection of it glide across the polished surface of the countertop, then disappear, and that was when I reached for my phone. Not to call anyone, not yet, but to take a picture of the letter. Then another, close up on the signature, the date, the language, documenting everything exactly as it arrived, because sequence matters, timestamps matter, and once that was done, I walked back into the garage, the smell of paint still faint but present, a reminder that this was ongoing, not finished, and I pulled a small notepad from the workbench, writing down the time the letter was received, the condition of the envelope, the exact phrasing of the key sections, building a parallel record to the digital one, because redundancy is not paranoia, it is preparation. And as I worked, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk, lighter this time, hesitant, and when I glanced up, one of the neighbors stood just beyond the edge of my driveway, pretending to adjust something on her phone while clearly looking at the car, at the gray paint, at the situation she was trying not to be part of. And for a moment our eyes met, and she looked away quickly, like acknowledgement itself could get her pulled into something she did not want. And that told me more than anything Brenda had said. This was not just enforcement. This was control through silence, through pressure, through making sure no one stepped out of line. And I turned back to the Mustang, running my hand just above the surface without touching it this time, measuring the damage, the layers, the work it would take to restore it properly. And I already knew it would not be quick, not cheap, not simple. But that was not the point. The point was that they believed they could define what happened next, that they had already written the outcome. And I picked up the letter again, folding it once along the original crease, precise, controlled, and placed it into a clean folder on the workbench, the first physical piece in what was becoming a very complete record. And as I closed the folder, I could feel the shift settling in, quiet but certain, because they were still playing by their rules, still moving within the limits they understood, and they had no idea those limits had already been exceeded. The next move came faster than most people would expect because control systems do not wait. They reinforce, they tighten, they push until resistance either breaks or disappears. And at 11:03 a.m. my phone buzzed with an email notification, subject line clean and direct, final compliance notice. And I opened it without urgency, standing in the same garage where the smell of paint had now settled into something faint but permanent, like a reminder that had no intention of leaving. And the email mirrored the letter almost exactly, but with one important addition, a deadline, 72 hours to remit payment and confirm compliance or face further action, vague enough to sound serious. specific enough to create pressure. And attached was a digital invoice, itemized, calculated, confident, as if they expected immediate submission, as if this was just another routine collection, and I studied it the same way I studied everything else, not reacting, not responding, just reading between the lines, noting the language, the escalation, the shift from suggestion to demand, because that is where intent sharpens into something actionable. And I set the phone down on the workbench, screen still lit, the numbers staring back at me like they meant something, like they had weight, and for most people they probably would. But numbers without authority are just ink, and I reached for the folder again, adding the printed copy of the email to the growing stack, aligning it perfectly with the letter from earlier, building continuity, building sequence, and as I did, the low rumble of another vehicle rolled past outside, slower this time, deliberate, and I stepped just enough to catch the reflection in the side mirror of the Mustang. The same contractor van from the night before. Different time, same route, circling, checking, and that was when the pattern locked into place. This was not just HOA enforcement. This was coordinated follow-up, reinforcement through presence, and I picked up my phone again, not to respond to the email, but to capture the license plate as it passed, zooming in, freezing the frame, adding it to the file, another piece, another connection, and for a moment I stood there, letting the quiet settle again, feeling the weight of everything aligning. Exactly where it needed to be, because once patterns become visible, they stop being random, they become predictable, and predictable behavior is the easiest thing to document, and I walked back toward the front of the house, opening the door just enough to retrieve the small notice that had been taped to it sometime between the email and now. Adhesive still fresh, edges curling slightly in the heat. Another violation, another fee, another attempt to stack pressure quickly, and I peeled it off slowly, careful not to tear it, reading it once before adding it to the folder as well, because repetition is not just annoyance, it is evidence of escalation, and as I closed the folder again, I could hear voices across the street, low, controlled, neighbors talking without wanting to be heard, and I glanced up just long enough to catch them looking in my direction before turning away. The same pattern again, awareness without involvement, and that told me everything I needed to know about how far this had spread, how visible it had become, and I leaned back against the workbench, arms relaxed, breathing steady. Because this was the moment most people react, most people push back, most people try to stop it before it grows. But stopping it early would leave gaps, unanswered questions, incomplete records, and I do not work with incomplete records. I let things develop until there is no room for interpretation, until every step is documented, every action recorded, every assumption exposed. And I looked at the Mustang again, at the gray paint that had started all of this, at the reflection that no longer matched the reality underneath, and I let that image settle into place, because it was not just damage, it was the starting point, the first move in a sequence they believed they controlled, and they were about to take several more moves, exactly the way I needed them to. The meeting notice came that evening, not by mail this time, not by email, but hand-delivered, slipped into a clear plastic sleeve, and taped directly to my front door at eye level like they wanted to make sure it could not be ignored. Bold header. Emergency HOA board session. Date set for the next night at 7 p.m. Location listed as the community clubhouse 2 streets over. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, reading it twice, then once more slower, not for comprehension, but for tone. Because urgency is rarely about necessity. It is about control, about pulling people into a space where decisions are already framed, where outcomes are expected, and I peeled the notice off carefully, the adhesive resisting just enough to leave a faint outline on the glass, and I added it to the folder without hesitation. Another piece, another step in the sequence they were building without realizing it. And inside the house the air felt still, controlled, the kind of quiet that comes before something shifts, and I set the folder down on the kitchen table, opening it, flipping through each page one by one. The letter, the email, the invoice, the violation notice, the printed stills from the footage, each one aligned, ordered, cleaned, and I paused on the image from 2:17 a.m., 3 figures under the security light, reflective strips catching just enough brightness to outline movement, and Brenda at the edge of the frame, directing, not participating, but fully present, and I let that Image sit there for a second longer before closing the folder again. Because tomorrow was not about discovery anymore. It was about presentation, and presentation requires precision, and I moved back into the garage. The faint smell of paint now almost gone, but not forgotten, and I ran my hand along the edge of the workbench, feeling the smooth surface, grounding myself in something solid, something controlled, and I reached for a clean envelope, placing inside it a select set of documents. Not everything, just enough, just the right pieces, because you do not show your entire hand at once. You show exactly what is needed to shift the room. And as I sealed it, the sound of distant conversation drifted through the open window. Neighbors talking again, lower this time, more cautious, like they knew something was coming but did not know what. And I stepped outside onto the driveway, the night air cooler, carrying the faint hum of the clubhouse lights in the distance, and I looked down the street toward where the meeting would take place, measuring distance again, timing, angles, routine, and I could already see the pattern forming. Cars would line the curb, people would gather in small groups. Brenda would take position at the front, controlling the agenda, controlling the narrative, and they would expect compliance, apology, payment, closure, but what they were actually getting was something else entirely, something they had not prepared for. And I turned back toward the garage, glancing once more at the Mustang, at the gray paint that started all of this, at the reflection that no longer matched reality. And I reached up, adjusting my sleeve slightly, a habit more than a necessity, aligning everything the way it should be, because details matter, even the smallest ones, and inside the house, on the table, the folder sat closed, complete for now, waiting, and I knew exactly how tomorrow would unfold, not because I would control every moment, but because they would follow the same pattern, the same confidence, the same assumptions, and that was all I needed. Because when people believe they are in control, they stop looking for what they missed, and what they missed was already sitting in that folder, already structured, already ready, and by the time they realized it, the outcome would not be something they could argue. It would be something they would have to face. The clubhouse lights were already on when I pulled up at 6:52 p.m., bright, steady, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawn like everything inside had already been decided before anyone even walked through the door, and I stepped out slowly, closing the car behind me with a soft click that barely carried across the quiet street. And I could feel the shift immediately, small conversations tapering off, heads turning just enough to acknowledge my presence without fully committing to it, neighbors clustered in tight circles, voices low, careful, the same pattern of observation without involvement, and I walked past them without stopping, the faint scent of polished wood and air freshener meeting me as I pushed the clubhouse door open, and inside it was exactly what I expected, rows of folding chairs arranged with precision, a long table at the front where Brenda sat with her clipboard already open, flanked by the same board members from the driveway, all of them positioned like they were about to conduct something official, something controlled. And she looked up the moment I entered, that same practiced smile locking into place, confident, assured, like this was her stage, like she owned the outcome before it even started. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "We appreciate you attending on such short notice," and I gave a small nod, moving toward the back of the room instead of the front, choosing a seat where I could see everything, every movement, every reaction. Because position matters, vantage point matters, and as more residents filtered in, filling the chairs, the room took on a low hum of anticipation, the kind that builds when people expect confrontation but do not know what form it will take. And at exactly 7 p.m., Brenda tapped her pen lightly against the table, a small, sharp sound that cut through the noise and pulled the room into silence. "This emergency session is called to address a serious compliance issue affecting community standards," she began, her tone measured, rehearsed, each word placed carefully, and she went through the motions, referencing the notices, the violations, the so-called corrective action, building her narrative step by step, presenting it as orderly, justified, necessary, and I let her speak without interruption, letting the structure fully form. Because you do not interrupt someone building their own case. You let them complete it, and when she finished, she looked directly at me, expectation clear, the room following her gaze, waiting, and I stood slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, just controlled, and I walked toward the front, the faint sound of my steps against the polished floor the only thing breaking the silence. And when I reached the table, I placed the envelope down in front of her, not sliding it, not emphasizing it, just setting it there like it belonged. And for a brief moment she hesitated, her eyes flicking to it, then back to me, the first crack in her certainty, and I opened it myself, pulling out the documents one by one, laying them out in a clean line across the table, printed stills from the footage, timestamps. Clear, images sharp, the contractor van, the figures, her position at the edge of the frame, directing, and the room shifted instantly, the quiet turning heavier, more focused, and I did not raise my voice, did not change my tone. I simply let the images speak, then reached into my pocket and placed something else beside them, small, metallic, unmistakable under the bright clubhouse lights. And that was the moment the air changed completely, because confidence built on assumption does not survive exposure. And as the room fell into a silence that felt different than before, I finally spoke, calm, even, precise. "You documented your actions," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "I just made sure they were recorded properly." And for the first time since this started, Brenda Whitmore did not have an immediate response. The silence held for a few seconds longer than most people could tolerate, the kind that presses in from all sides and forces every eye in the room to stay exactly where it is. And I watched Brenda's expression shift in real time, not dramatically, not enough for someone untrained to catch it, but enough, the tightness around her eyes, the slight delay before she reached for one of the printed images, like she needed something physical to anchor herself, and she picked it up carefully, scanning it. Then the next, her movements slower now, measured, no longer confident, and I could feel the room leaning with her, every person tracking the same details, the same timestamps, the same angles, and the sound of someone clearing their throat in the back echoed louder than it should have, because uncertainty amplifies everything. And I rested my hand lightly on the table, steady, controlled, not claiming space, just holding it. And when she finally looked up at me, that practiced smile was gone, replaced by something sharper, something calculating. "This does not prove what you think it proves," she said, voice still composed but missing that earlier certainty, and I nodded once, because she was right, not entirely, not on its own. And that was the point. I was not relying on a single piece. I was relying on sequence, on pattern, on the full record, and I reached into the envelope again, pulling out the printed copy of the email, the invoice, the violation notices, placing them beside the images in a clean line. Then one more sheet, the contractor information tied to the license plate, the timeline aligning everything from the moment the work was ordered to the moment it was completed. And I did not rush, did not speak over her. I let the documents build their own weight. Because paper does not argue, it accumulates, and the room shifted again. The quiet turning from anticipation into something heavier, something closer to realization. And one of the board members leaned forward, eyes moving quickly across the pages, then back to Brenda, waiting, looking for direction that was no longer clear. And that was when I moved my hand slightly, just enough to slide the small metallic object forward into the center of the table, letting it catch the light fully, letting it be seen from every angle, unmistakable now, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the room, the kind people try to suppress and fail. And I spoke again, calm, even, the same tone I had used from the beginning. "This is not a compliance issue," I said, each word placed deliberately. "This is unauthorized entry, property damage, and coordinated action carried out under the assumption of authority that does not extend this far." And I let that settle, did not push it, did not escalate it, because escalation was not necessary. The structure was already complete, and Brenda's hand, still holding one of the images, lowered slowly to the table, her posture adjusting, not collapsing, but recalibrating, like she was trying to find a position that still gave her control. And it was not there anymore, not in this room, not with this record, and I could see it in the way the other residents were no longer looking at me. They were looking at her, waiting, reassessing, the dynamic shifting without a single raised voice, and I straightened slightly, not out of tension but out of habit, alignment returning to where it should be, and I gathered the edge of the documents with my fingertips, not taking them back, just organizing them, reinforcing the order they had already created, and I met her eyes one last time, steady, unhurried, because this part matters, the moment where understanding replaces assumption, and I let the final piece fall into place without force, without emphasis. What happens next is not decided here, I said quietly. It follows the record, and I stepped back just enough to give the room space. Because once the record is complete, it does not need to be argued, it moves on. Its own, and as the silence settled again, different now, grounded, unavoidable, I knew the outcome was no longer a question. It was a process already in motion, one they had started, one they had documented, and one they could not control anymore.